Hey YouTube, welcome back to another History Teacher Reacts video. I'm Mr. Terry as I continue my search for historical knowledge found here on the internet. Alright, today we are hitting up episode 4 of our Inca Empire series. So this is a 5-part series. I think I might have said it was a 4-part series earlier, but I found out that it's actually 5 parts. So this is not the last. We'll have one more after this. Now this episode is titled The Andean Apocalypse, which kind of seems fitting. So it looks like with this, maybe what we see here is possibly the entrance of Francisco Pizarro and the Spanish conquistadors, which come in the early 1530s. And of course, you know, the Inca Empire will be taken advantage of and paved the way for the Spanish Empire to come into South America and establish itself there. So we've seen some great stuff so far, especially some of the cultural aspects of their reverence for their dead and kind of, you know, lingering communication with their dead, with their leaders. And I think that's been a really cool thing to kind of learn about and to learn more as we go on here. But yeah, I'm interested to see now when these worlds collide with the entrance of the Spanish. All right, this video, again, is part of Extra Credits or Extra History. I believe one of the best history channels on YouTube entirely. So make sure that you go down into our description right here. A link to the original video is there. Make sure you're supported. Give it the view, like, subscribe, thumbs up, all that kind of stuff because they're an awesome channel. And if you like what you see here, I'd love to have you as a sub and be a part of our community. Some links to some fun stuff down below. But let's go ahead and get started.
Francisco Pizarro is shocked by what he sees. On his first expedition 4 years ago, he had landed in this very city. It's where he learned about the so-called Inca Empire he'd come to conquer. Then, there had been 1,000 stone buildings, large seagoing rafts in the harbor with great white sails. Crowds had come out to greet them, to offer gifts and touch the strange white and black skin of the foreigners.
You know, you'd wish that... A question I was having with this, I've actually just in my class been talking about this exact instance. And something I was wondering, and I did look more into, and if you know, let me know in the comments, was did the Inca Empire know what happened to the Aztec Empire in Central America? You know, because it happened back in about 1521 with Cortez's conquest of the Aztec Empire. Did they know? Because I thought if they did, the Inca would not have been as welcoming as you're seeing right here to the Spanish as they were. If you know, let me know.
Now, it was a ruin. Most of the populace, it seemed, had fled. He directs his translator, a native man he'd kidnapped during the last expedition, to ask one question. What happened here? The answer: plague, death, and civil war.
Yeah. Yeah. Amazing how fast the like things like smallpox spread. I mean, in a lot of places, it spread even faster than the Spanish traveled. So the Spanish bring it over, and you know the big whole thing with the Native Americans not being immune to the germs that create diseases that Europeans are immune to is a big thing because it wipes out 90% of the population. But yeah, it traveled so fast it could, you know, the disease traveled faster than the Spanish.
It came from the north. Everyone was sure of it. It turned people's skins black and made blood flow from their nose and mouths.
Ugh.
And it was almost always fatal. Today, we assume this disease was hemorrhagic smallpox or measles, likely swept down from Mexico, where Cortez's men had brought it to the Aztec Empire. But the inhabitants of the Inca Empire had no name for the illness that ravaged them. There's no way to solidly estimate the impact of this plague upon the Inca population. But in some areas, the population may have dropped 90%. And no one was spared.
I've seen that percentage like basically everywhere in Native American communities, Aztec and the like. 90%, 9 out of 10 seems to be a pretty well agreed upon number. That's incredible.
When the sickness reached the empire, Emperor Huayna Capac was up north in Quito, the place he'd fashioned into the second city of his empire, and where he marshaled his forces to crush rebels in what is now Ecuador and Colombia. He was no fool. He isolated himself. But the strange marks found him anyway. Within days, he was dying. And fearing that the emperor was about to make his transition into the spirit world, the royal court asked him to name a successor. He did.
Atahualpa.
The son he named, though, was already dead. A victim of the same illness which had swept through the royal court. Though the Spanish did not know it, They didn't understand disease transmission well enough to use it intentionally. They had effectively decapitated the Inca political leadership before Pizarro's men had even arrived. With both the Sapa Inca and his heir apparent dead, the rest of the empire was left to decide who would rule. Back in Cusco, the nobles appointed one of the emperor's sons, Huascar, as the new ruler, which may not have been the best choice, as Huascar was a drunken party boy who had the habit of stealing other nobles' wives and then executing them if they objected.
What? That's like every leader ever.
He also made moves to seize lands and estates held by his mummified predecessors and their families. Or maybe not, because the accounts that claim that come from a Spanish chronicler who got the story from his Inca wife, a woman who was previously married to Huascar's half-brother and rival for the throne, a man named Atahualpa.
Okay.
Though Atahualpa and Huascar were both sons of the emperor, they had different mothers, with Huascar's mother being Inca and Atahualpa's mother coming from a non-Inca northern royal line.
Okay, this is like going way over my head. This looks way too complicated. There are way too much love triangles happening here. I just know Atahualpa is eventually going to be the emperor and is the one that kind of is going to meet up with Pizarro. Now I do know, and it's kind of known here, that when Pizarro is coming in here, they had in fact gone over a massive civil war, right? The Inca. And as you could probably understand, the Inca then would have been in a very weakened state if they had just gotten over a civil war. Also makes it more likely that someone like Pizarro would have plenty of people that he could recruit locally to fight for him if needed. The same thing happened to Cortez up in the Aztec Empire in Mexico. The bulk of his fighting force came from finding people that were disgruntled or discontent with the Aztec Empire and using them as allies to be able to make up a military force. And the Spanish would not have been successful without it.
Temperamentally, they couldn't have been more different. While Huascar grew up steeped in the court life of Cusco, Atahualpa had traveled and fought with his father in the Inca's northern campaigns. Huascar had the loyalty of the Cusco elite, and Atahualpa had the hearts of the battle-hardened army.
Who do you think is more important to have on your side? The military or the elites, social elites? Vote now below.
So when the nobles of Cusco declared Huascar to be the Sapa Inca and Atahualpa to be the governor of Quito, it was pretty clear what was about to happen. Civil war.
Yep.
Now, a little civil war was, to be honest, not really a big deal. Practically expected. With no concept of primogeniture, it was normal for the Incas to fight a few battles to figure out who would succeed.
Remember this, primogeniture. Europe also had an issue with this, and it was this fact that unless you were the next heir or whatever, like the oldest son or oldest in the line, you were expected to have to get your own pretty much wealth and land and stuff. So these younger nobles that, again, don't have it handed down to them, they have to go get it themselves. And the only way you could do it is fight. Remember in the other videos too, something interesting is even when you're dead, if you're one of these leaders and you own property, you're still technically the property owner in your death. And they talked about that before, how these previous kings, even though they were dead, they had this land that couldn't be taken over by their family members. And it was just, people would just upkeep this land and homes and stuff, even though the person that technically owned it was dead. That's going to provide a lot of social problems.
Indeed, if a claimant had the guile, military skill, and fortitude to defeat his rivals, wouldn't that actually prove he was the best man for the job? And it was clear that Atahualpa wanted the royal tassel. Therefore, when Atahualpa sent a delegation to present Huascar with coronation gifts, the emperor refused the gifts, killed the ambassadors, and sent the military captains back dressed in women's clothing. A declaration of civil war. It was not the greatest idea, though. After all, Atahualpa was up in Quito, where their father had been fighting, with all of his battle-hardened troops, and his best generals, who were all loyal to Atahualpa, who was also part northern and had major support. But Atahualpa was also far north, and already fighting against rebellions that predated the Civil War, not to mention now these new provincial rebellions that supported Huascar. And Huascar had his own assets, namely the royal tassel, the capital, and the larger army. He marched north, in some accounts even capturing Atahualpa, who then supposedly proceeded to escape after a woman smuggled him in a jailbreak kit during a drunken victory party. But here's what's not in doubt. This war was vicious and costly. It ripped the empire apart. and in concert with the ongoing smallpox pandemic, may have dropped populations in some regions by 95%.
Yeah. So you can see there's going to be no winner in this civil war. They're both going to be losers.
The empire, already under strain during Huayna Capac's reign,
Wait, what is this supposed to be? Like a potato?
teetered on the brink of collapse. The turning point came when the two armies met in central Ecuador. Huascar's force was much larger, led by a veteran general known as the Fox. But it was also made up of militia conscripts unused to war. Where Atahualpa's force, on the other hand, was a battle-hardened army made up from the best troops in the empire.
Sure, numbers aren't everything.
Men drafted from warrior societies who the Inca from birth prepared for war. Experienced slingers from the Andes, hard Ecuadorian infantrymen, and archers from the Amazon who dipped their arrows in serpent venom and frog toxins.
Whoa.
The battle
Genius.
did not last long. For if history teaches us one thing, it's the age-old adage, don't bring conscripts to a hardened veteran fight.
True.
Seriously, that's all over.
We have this. We talk about this sometimes in my classes. Of the difference between professional or volunteer armies versus conscripted armies. Conscript means drafted, right? They take people for however they set it up by just mandatory. Everybody has to serve or random, whatever. So those are people that didn't have no intention going in. Of course, they're going to fight hard, but they're obviously not going to be as good as a professional army.
Atahualpa had the Fox's skull made into a gold-accented drinking cup. He'd killed the captured general.
Wait, what?
Of the Fox's skull. Historical text. You can look that up. When it was all over, though, Atahualpa had the Fox's skull made into a gold-accented drinking cup. He'd killed the captured general by filling him with arrows and darts.
Talk about
and
flexing.
For what was to come.
He covered the enemy's head in gold and used it as a drinking cup. Whoa. That is a big-time flex. I have to remember that.
Atahualpa tried to lure soldiers away from Huascar's retreating army with offers of clemency. However, when those offers to defect went unanswered, he turned to another tactic, terror. When he captured the enemy, he had them slaughtered and their bodies desecrated. Settling in the northern city of Cajamarca, he sent his army ahead with orders to take Cusco. And it did not take long. Atahualpa's bloody tactics had destroyed the enemy morale, and Huascar had lost his nerve. Even when Huascar's army occupied forts where they had an advantage of terrain and defensive barriers, they often failed to hold. So when Atahualpa's army reached Cusco, Huascar evacuated rather than fight.
Like,
so
we
he
out.
was a captive, and his legacy destroyed. And when we say destroyed, we mean destroyed. One of Atahualpa's generals entered Huascar's family compound, where his wives and children lived, and spared no one regardless of age or gender. Then they rounded up the historians who kept the records of Huascar's reign, those who knew what each knot represented on the quipu that kept royal history, and they killed them. Afterward, they burned the quipu.
So wait, they were actually able to use the quipu to track down people? Let me go back. Quipu is this, if you remember from the previous videos. The Inca didn't have a writing system, but they did have a record-keeping system, which they used these pieces of string with knots in them to track things.
Rounded up the historians who and spared no one regardless of age or gender. Then they rounded up the historians who kept the records of Huascar's reign, those who knew what each knot represented on the quipu that kept royal history, and they killed them.
Okay,
Afterward, they burned the quipu, even though the people trained to interpret them were dead. And then they destroyed the mummies of his most powerful ancestors.
See, and that's a huge deal, because you worshipped your ancestors. Destroying the mummified ancestors of your enemy is a huge deal, and probably seen as evil, sacrilegious that way.
All of this in front of the deposed emperor's own eyes. His victory complete, Atahualpa prepared to march south and enter Cusco. There were things to attend to, not the least of them weeks of victory feasts to celebrate his coronation.
Taters and jerky.
But there was another matter that kept him. A force was marshaling behind him, heading south toward Cajamarca. They were not allies of his half-brother, that was certain. Reports from survivors said these strangers had pale skin and wore clothing made of metal. They rode enormous beasts, larger than llamas, and evil long-fanged creatures trotted at their heels. And they used bizarre weapons that made a noise like thunder and expelled smoke. Most importantly,
I think it's the Europeans.
Reports said that they killed as they marched. Everywhere they went, they killed without reason, captured anyone they could, and questioned them under torture.
They're not wrong.
They wanted to know the way to the emperor and his gold. Such impertinence, Atahualpa thought. Such belligerence from a force of only 168 men. They were, of course, conquistadors.
Dang, I
Pizarro-
thought his was upwards to 500 for Pizarro. Maybe I was mixing up with Cortez at that time, but that's insanely low numbers. Talk about Inca Empire is like 11 million people in it.
Pizarro's third expedition. And though they carried documents from the Spanish crown, making it their duty to claim Peru for Spain and Christianize the population, they were actually here
Christianize the
for
kingdom.
the money. This venture was an entrepreneurial one, and each man on it was a shareholder. If he enlisted with infantry weapons, he gained a small slice
DuckTales.
of whatever treasure they captured. But if the men who'd brought horses, plate armor, and contributed ships and provisions, men like their leader Pizarro and one of his captains Hernando de Soto, they could get very rich indeed. But Pizarro was already very rich indeed.
Yeah, he was a wealthy
In
man,
fact,
right?
he
A
was a
nobleman
veteran
anyway.
of several conquistador raids, but he was also aging and wanted to make his mark on the world the same way Cortez had done when he overthrew the Aztec Empire. He carried documents in his pocket that, once the Incas were overthrown, would make him the Spanish governor of Peru.
Yep.
So he was surprised when a group of Incan ambassadors met them on the road bearing gifts. It seemed they would be received. The Sapa Inca, his translator said, wanted to meet them. Pizarro didn't realize that the gifts were a threat, the Incas' usual modus operandi of displaying their generosity, that, if spurned, would lead to annihilation.
I thought I'd heard something like this. I'd been doing some research on this stuff recently that perhaps the gift giving idea again had a different meaning to like some of these Mesoamerican cultures in this. And someone's got to back me up on this or let me know that giving a gift isn't necessarily, it wasn't like a welcoming thing, but like, hey, get out of here kind of thing. Take this and leave. I want to rewind that a second because I want to see if that's what they were talking about. But I'm in this thought in my head that I had heard that before. Because, again, it doesn't make sense, right? Because what they're saying is Atahualpa knew that these people had a bad reputation, these Spanish. But coming to them with such open arms and all this, like, it sounds... doesn't make sense. But let me go back because I want to make sure I didn't miss something here. So Pizarro knows if he conquers them, then he gets to be the governor of the new Spanish Empire here. New Castile, I think is what they're going to call it.
So he was surprised when a group of Incan ambassadors met them on the road bearing gifts. It seemed they would be received. The Sapa Inca, his translator said, wanted to meet them. Pizarro didn't realize that the gifts were a threat, the Incas' usual modus operandi of displaying their generosity, that, if spurned, would lead to annihilation. Each item carefully selected to send a message. So Pizarro and his men walked
so
deeper
you're right.
into Atahualpa's territory, drawn into a position where the Incan army of 40,000 could envelop their little party.
For sure.
Pizarro and Atahualpa were about to come face to face in a meeting that would shatter an empire. Not to mention, cost both men their lives. Special thanks to educational tier patrons Ahmed Ziad Turk, Joseph Blaine, and Gerald Spencer Dinan.
Thanks, patrons. All right, let's talk about it. All right, so this episode actually taught me a ton. A lot more about that civil war, because I had known that the Inca had this civil war that Pizarro was kind of able to exploit, but not some of the details of it and how brutal it was and how nasty Atahualpa was to Huascar. And how he treated them and did all those things with the killing of the mummies and slaughtering his family all in front of him and things like that. I'm interested to learn more again about this whole exchange that has just happened here at the end of the video with the gift giving, because it sounds like what they're saying is the gift giving was kind of like a, hey, take this and leave kind of thing. But it wasn't really seen, I guess, like that by the Spanish. If you know a little more about that, let me know in the comments. But if that's true, then I guess we chalk this one up to cultural misunderstandings, which definitely seems possible. As again, remember, these civilizations have developed separately on different sides of the planet, for thousands of years. So these kind of miscommunications and misunderstandings are likely to happen, and did in a bunch of other cases as well. So interested again to see now what the final episode 5 is going to be like with the actual meetup of that, because there's some interesting stories that I know. There's the story, if you've heard about, when Atahualpa's presented a Bible, which has been a famous one that I know is kind of surrounded in a bit of conjecture, and the fact we don't know if it went down that way, because again, the interesting thing being Atahualpa's never seen a book before, doesn't really know what a Bible is or how it works, and not respecting it, and that offending the Spanish. So I'm hoping they get into that. Maybe they will, maybe they won't, but that's another interesting story to definitely get into, is the Atahualpa and the Bible story. We look at it in class, in my class, and look at some sources that talk about it, which again just shows a good example of cultural misunderstandings from different civilizations developing differently from each other. All right, now, make sure you stay tuned and look out for the final episode, episode 5. Hope to get to that shortly. I'm assuming you saw the previous episodes, but make sure you do that. Once again, support Extra Credits by going down below, and you'll see a link to the video. Make sure you sub to them, give them the view time. They are very supportive of our channel here, and really just pleased to have a high-quality form of historical entertainment out there that we can improve our understanding with. All right, again, there's links down below to some other stuff, Discord, my gaming channel, Teespring, a bunch of other fun things. Come join our community over on Discord, and with that, we'll see you next time. Bye.